So Sarah, can you tell us what is actually happening with this New York Times suing the Pentagon? How serious is this? Tell us, in the just for the beginning, sort of lay it out for the audience as to what is actually happening.
Yeah, so I think this is an incredibly important escalation of the Trump administration. Of course, this has its past, but I think we are talking a very serious upgrade. So on Wednesday, we've seen on the spotlight the Pentagon rule book, the new rule book for reporters that is already in force, being changed. And it's brutal for press freedom. So, what exactly did the Pentagon say and did in this update of their book rules? So, the Defense Department they rolled out a new press credential policy. So at face value, to say it's just a credential press policy for anyone who wants to have a Pentagon badge, but actually it is pretty sinister what is behind this new policy. So reporters they have they must sign a 21 pages agreement to keep or to get access to the building. So the document is radically limits how journalists can get their news, how we can get our news, how they can report. So it restricts asking for tips from sources, restrict contacting Pentagon employees as sources, and tells reporters not to solicit, not to publish whatever they mean there is unauthorized information, and even if it's unclassified. So it's very broadly formulated, and it's not. So reporters are really they cannot solicit, publish what the Pentagon deems to be unauthorized information. Uh, what is this? This is actually a aggressive violation of press freedom, a blunt one. So and it applies to whom? It applies to entire Pentagon press corps. So anyone who wants regular on-site access, not just a few individuals reporter. If you and I or whoever is a reporter, they will have to sign those rules. And Pentagon will only allow lawful news gathering. And this rule extends to offsite as well.
Also, I just want to point out that one of the main things about investigative journalism is the ability to talk to people, to talk to sources inside, anywhere, basically, right? You need to be able to talk to whistleblowers. You need to be able to talk to insiders in order to do your job. Once you block that avenue, then what is investigative journalism, right?
Yeah. So the thing is, they have a sign or else deadline, right? Either you sign it or you have to turn in your credentials within 48 hours. And what we saw is that a dozen of veteran Pentagon's reporter, including 6 from the New York Times, refused to sign, and rightly so. And so they handed their badges and they clear out their workspaces. And now 15 of reporters agreed to this new regime, which means they will not be reporting. They will not be doing what journalists do. They will be conveying the official messages from the Pentagon and branding it as journalism, as investigative journalism. So otherwise, they would have to lose their passes, their assigned working areas. And it's no longer free access. It's a privileged access where you have to conform to rules that destroy the journalist practice and our right to know. Sorry.
Well, I'm just curious about this because for a while now, and even during Trump's first term, there was a lot of talk about this. He was restricting people coming into the press room, but maybe not on this official capacity. So can you explain how putting it into a legal process makes this so much worse than before? We could kind of see, for example, Trump would just not Trump, but well, not just Trump, but the press secretary would not call on people that they didn't deem to be friendly press, right? But now there's a legal or there's an attempt for a legal thing. And why is that different from what I've just been saying?
this is fundamentally different. And I think you touch a very important point. So what the government is saying is making official that you can only enter this public power center if you surrender fundamental rights of the press freedom. Once you establish this, we know that the American government has been controlling the press and exercising an extra-official editorial authority for a long, long time. And I think most of them, they have also agreed with it. They have played along with it. So we will talk about the Assange case afterwards, and we'll see how this played out. But what I'm saying is fundamentally different when you have a political mandate and when you have a legal one, because a legal one means you have consequences if you don't follow, and the courts will have it binding on them. The institutions will apply it bindingly, and you have civil servants having to apply bindingly, otherwise they will have disciplinary procedures. You create a social consensus that press freedom no longer exists in the United States of America, and exactly where it needs to exist most, which are military activities, killing, extraofficial killings that we see in WikiLeaks, and we've seen that Iraq body counts, the war crimes. We're not talking about warmongering. We are going beyond that. We're talking about war crimes that the US perpetrated against international law, against human dignity, torture camps. We have the right to know this. And if it wasn't for whistleblowers, if it wasn't for the brave journalists that risk so much, we will never know this. We will still think that the military, the American military, has always operated within its limits, its scope. And we know the military class, they tend to think that they have authority over democracy, authority over constitutional authority. They are a higher being, a higher caste that needs to supervise all of us, including our right to know and the press. Guess what? They don't have editorial freedom, and it's not like a booklet that is adequate to overrule constitutional rights. So, so in one other point, it's discriminatory because what the policy says if you were critical to the Pentagon, you're out. Even the mainstream, who are not radically, we know they are not radically against the Pentagon, and they exchange information with the Department of State and Department of Justice before they publish hot material. But so it's inviting strongly poor administration outlets within the Pentagon and expelling everyone who have a critical view on the killing of civilians, for instance, on how the Pentagon is perpetrating a genocide in Gaza, what they're doing in other parts of the world, what the Americans are doing in Sudan, and what they're doing at home as well, right? Because so the government, they're basically creating a consensus, a legal one, where you will now say what we want you to say. So I would say, is censorship textbook. Censorship, it could be a script of an authoritarian regime to control press freedom. The US has no moral grounds to criticize any country or any authoritarian regime. Look what they are doing and put into legislation. So it's pure arbitrary power exercise, no due process, just give me your pass. And so the reaction is correct. The Times sued, and the journalists are leaving, and even major outlets who have aligned with Pentagon for many, many years, like the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN, Reuters, AP, NRP, ABC, CBS, NBC, Fox News, The Guardian, The Atlantic, among others, say they announced they are not signing the agreement, and they are rightly so suing the Pentagon under the First Amendment. It's unprecedented. Yes, it is. But we know the same outlets have been silent for a long, long time, and we can get into that right now. But it's a threat to core journalistic protections, is a core to fundamental right of freedom of speech, is a core to our fundamental, it's a violation, it's a blunt violation of freedom of speech. And in the sense, I would say the fact that you're putting it to a legal status, it is unprecedented.
I mean, I think there are several things to unpack there. Like one of the things is that as we both worked with to free Assange, free Julian Assange, and he was freed last year in June. But the reason he was free, I mean, the way he was freed, basically they forced him to admit to journalism as a criminal act. That was kind of the interesting thing about him being freed. It was not a pardon in a sense. He had to essentially plead guilty for committing the crime of essentially exposing the war crimes of the US empire. And so that gives us a precedence for what's happening. Now, what's interesting though about this moment is the New York Times has, you just said these journalists that signed off on it are basically stenographers of the Pentagon. But we know for a really long time that these huge media legacy outlets like the New York Times has basically been parroting State Department narratives for a really long time. They have been one of the biggest tools of imperial propaganda. So what's interesting in this moment, and this is the contradiction that Trump really brings to the US empire, is because he is so blatant, he's so authoritarian in his manner, in his way of speaking. He just says out loud what the US has taken great pains to cover and great pains to create and curate this propaganda so that people don't even realize that they're being propagandized. And Trump just goes in there and he does exactly he just breaks down any pretense that the Pentagon isn't in control of the media apparatus.
Yes, I think there are two. So there's so many valuable points in what you're saying. Before we talk about the Assange case, which I'm pretty comfortable in saying it was the case, it was the test case, a successful one, as you put out. I'm going to go back to that. But before this, I think we need to be very clear that those news outlets have been complicit in working together with the Department of Justice, working together with Pentagon, so much so that in the Assange case and in the persecution of a lot of whistleblowers, they have kept mainly a very low profile, to say the least. And we kept announcing this affects another journalist today, but it will affect your outlet later on. So I think the escalation against journalism is not a Trump exclusive, certainly not. It's part of how the structure works in the United States. It's a silent power that controls press freedom, has an extra official editorial authority. But I do think there are differences in the Trump administration. It's not only a matter of masks off. I think there is a qualitative enhancement of something that already existed. So Trump is not creating anything, but he's taking to extremes things that American society have validated for many years, decades. So first of all, there under the Trump administration, the first administration, you had a aggressive persecution against leaks. I mean, there is no journalism without whistleblowers. There are no journalism without leaks. They are the most important sources to check power from within. And to criminalize them as spies or as terrorists, because we've seen this in the UK, this is against press freedom on its core. There is no journalist activity without the brave whistleblowers, without the brave leaks. And we've seen this throughout history. We've seen the amazing work and courage of Daniel Ellsberg revealing the Pentagon Papers, showing that the US was lying in the Congress. McNamara was lying, showing that they were losing the war in Vietnam and still sending the troops to die there and to kill. So Trump did something spectacular in his first administration, is that he used the Espionage Act to equalize journalistic activity with espionage. And he did this against Julian Assange. So it was the first time ever that someone who has no contract with the Department of Justice, no contract of confidentiality with any American authorities, but he was a journalist who has the right to maintain anonymity of their sources and the right and duty to protect their sources. He was accused of espionage. So you're creating the false equivalence of journalists with spies, which in fact, we know a lot of spies do cover themselves up as journalists. There are plenty of them, that there are studies showing this. Maybe that's where they're taking this idea from. But in this case, we have people who do genuine journalism. And this was a test case, this first application of the Espionage Act 2017, which is a very old law, a law designed to persecute anti-war dissidents on the beginning of the century. He used to persecute Assange. Assange was the test case. He is the precedents that work pretty well, and they are now expanding into other areas. And the Pentagon did the first step. So we saw that how in 2019, Trump's DOJ unsealed a superseding indictment charging Assange with 17 counts under the Espionage Act and 1 count to conspire to crack the password with Chelsea money. And what was the criminal act according to Trump? Receiving classified documents from a source, encouraging a source to provide more, and publish the material, having the material with him and publish the material. Like, these are standards of the journalist profession. So you are criminalizing journalism, not as something, as espionage. That's what Trump did successfully for the very first time in the Assange case, and now they are reproducing this. So that's exactly what investigative journalists do all the time. They work with leaks. That's what they do. And to use this for the act of publication, truthful information from the very mouth of the military, of the, they could never challenge the authenticity and the truth of those documents. So as they had no defense themselves, they decided to say this is espionage. And now with the Assange case, any journalist anywhere in the world can be charged under the Espionage Act and be required to be extradited to the US for publishing truthful information of public interest about, for instance, war crimes of the United States of America outside its territory. That's the precedent. And when Assange had to cut this deal, the deal was made such that this becomes a precedent. He had to plead guilty to what he said to journalists. He had to plead guilty to doing exactly what journalists do. So this is now a precedence in a jurisdiction that works with precedents. It's very serious what happened there. So we are seeing journalists' records being seized, being criminalized, and to ask source for more documents and all of this. This is part of the standard realistic. And it's very interesting, Ileana, because we had, during the Assange case, we had Priti Patel in the UK doing exactly this in legislation. Priti Patel is the Indian face of white supremacism in the UK. She was the Home Secretary under Boris Johnson. And although she is herself a migrant, herself of Indian descent, she was the most vicious and perverted Home Office that I could ever think of. And she was the one who signed Assange extradition at administrative level. So what she did is she supported since 2016 initiative to create a law to undermine anyone doing what Assange did. So what would be that? It would to treat unofficial disclosure of classified information with the same severity of espionage. This, Priti Patel, England. And she did an Official Secrets Act reform, which turned leaks and journalist activity in espionage, in like espionage. So the Home Office under Priti Patel. Do you have a picture of Priti Patel? I think we need to show the world who this woman is. Once I saw a comparison of description of her personality, which I think it couldn't be more precise. Priti Patel is the type of
She's
people.
very pretty. But yeah, she's like the precise type of imperial tool that Empire really likes, because she looks so elegant, and also she's a person of color. There's stuff like that kind of like provides cover, when Empire is imperializing, basically.
Yeah.
It's so useful for them to have this type of face. Here you go. This is where she's like behind with the British flag.
Yeah, but
So,
do you know Priti Patel? I saw this description of Priti Patel would be someone who usually visit a patient or a friend in a hospital under life support and would disconnect the life support to charge her own phone. I think this is the perfect metaphor to describe the level of perversion that her policies implied with migrants, with people of color like she is, with people of migration background like she is. I think this is self-hatred. This is deep-seated self-hatred. And you put power in the hands of such disqualified person. So her proposals floated around 2016, 2002. And and now in the UK, what you have here is pretty grim. You can have 14 years of jail for publishing information that they deem classified, whatever that means, And then after that, she wasn't satisfied, Ileana. She went to the National Security Bill, which is the National Security Act 2023. She introduced this, and it replaces the British old Official Secrets Act framework. And now we have new offences in the UK. If you obtain, if you disclose protected information, whatever that means, for or with a foreign power, it means I am going into other jurisdictions to criminalize you. I am exerting British jurisdiction on other countries that are sovereign. They create another offense, which is sabotage, foreign interference if you do this, and to assist the foreign intelligence service, whatever that means. And here I have a very personal story to tell. I used to be a British civil servant, a lawyer at the Department for Food, Environment and Affairs, and I was under disciplinary procedure where they clearly applied such protocols on me. They wanted to know my ideological alignment, and of course, it was under the disciplinary procedure where I have no right to a lawyer, no right to remain in silence, will be arbitrarities and official expedition in my life. It was about trying to figure out whether they could fit me in that. So this is a trend in the UK. UK is going through a very authoritarian wave, and this is being accepted as consensus. One day we'll see those British civil servants, when this escalates a lot, they will go just like the New York Times. Oh no, not that much. You can be authoritarian, but not that much. Now it's too close to me. So then you see people who work to it's to save their own faces and in a mode of survival, self-survival. Where are the morals? Where are the ethics? It's all about survival mechanisms. And I think the press have been a lot of that. They didn't care about Assange. And now the precedence of Assange case is coming to hunt them and bite them in the ass. That's what it is the Assange case as a ghost coming and biting them in the ass while they were all silent. So now in the UK and in the US, unofficial disclosures are espionage. and you don't have the right to a public interest defense. So you are creating confidentiality legally as if it's an absolute value. You don't have absolute values in a democracy. They always concur with other people's fundamental rights. They all concur with principles. So if you say confidentiality, as there is no defense, no exception to the exercise of confidentiality, what you're saying, and you have no other rights can compete with it. This is a classical pre-constitutional order before the Second World War. This is a classic authoritarian mentality that you have state, um, a value that protects the state as absolute. You can't do that. There are no absolute values. When they are conflicting, you need to balance them out. You need to find a solution that you preserve people's right to know, that you preserve the public interest, confidentiality that by default is always larger than the public interest. Killing people, killing 30,000 people in Iraq, burying them alive. No, this is confidentiality. No, no, no. Human rights is not as important as confidentiality.
I
Obama.
think what's important, though, to point out here is that one, the U.S. has always had this idea of freedom of speech. It's one of the only, I think, the only country that has such a robust standard of freedom of speech. The UK doesn't even have the freedom of speech. Australia doesn't have it. It's the U.S. was considered the gold standard of freedom of speech. Now, what does it
in their own minds, voices in their
what does that actually mean in reality, though, is that the U.S., because U.S. has been imperialist and U.S. has been the leader of the U.S. empire since around the 60s or 70s. There's some sort of controversy as to when they overtook the British. But because they have been the empire for that long, their freedom of speech has always had certain limits, but they were allowed to cover for that with this idea that we have this gold standard of freedom of speech. But it's always been weaponized against countries that are considered enemy of states, which is basically any country that wants to be sovereign is essentially an enemy of the US because it's an enemy of imperialism. Now, what this does, though, is that it completely takes off that cover for the US empire. But the other thing that's really interesting about it is that this gold standard of freedom of speech not only has been weaponized against countries, but it has also created this entire system of sophisticated curation of propaganda. Because people believe that the US has freedom of speech, all voices can be heard, etc., etc. Therefore, people don't even see the propaganda that we are consuming. No. And it's a very sophisticated way to create propaganda, because it's unseen for a lot of people. And so this is a very interesting moment in time with the New York Times, and just to be clear, the New York Times would not have probably would not have said anything if it wasn't Trump. Like, if it was Biden doing this, there might have been cover for it. But because it's Trump, they are allowed to speak up in a sense, right? Granted, Biden probably wouldn't have done it in such a clumsy, obvious way. But this is a very interesting moment for U.S. empire. As U.S. empire is getting more and more scary and more belligerent, it's also giving up a lot of its propagandic tools that has been its cover for a really long time. And that, I think, is a material difference to how U.S. imperialism is imperializing right now.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it's a great point, Ileana, because when things become more obvious, it's easier for us to see the invisible force, which is the propaganda. It's incredibly how people can be propagandized. We both have been propagandized throughout our lives.
But it doesn't make it less scary. And Carl is actually in the studio.
Comes here. I wanted to point out something to you. Do you
Okay,
know
sorry.
who Pete Hegseth is? Trump's Secretary of Defense. I think we need to talk about that.
Well, I think what's really interesting is that this directly relates to our next news story as well, because the U.S. escalations against Venezuela is supposedly also under Pete Hegseth. Granted, it's also under Marco Rubio, but Pete Hegseth has a supposedly important role in that as well.
But
But
in the empire, or in the way America is putting itself as a transnational force, first of all, marginalizing international agreements, international institutes, to put themselves in that role of a transnational authority. Then you put a person like Pete Hegseth as a Secretary of Defense. This is so scary, Ileana. This is so damn scary. This is a former Fox News host, a Iraq and Afghanistan vet, like the TV warrior cult, this type of person, a Christian nationalist. He has a tattoo collection of extreme imagery. He is a hard right Christian nationalist, ignorant, the type that thinks the earth is flat. And just to illustrate, in his biceps, he's had in Latin, Deus vult, that means a medieval crusades slogan, God wills it. So this is now widely used by the far right and anti-Muslim extremists in America. It's not a medieval sign. He also has a big Jerusalem cross on his chest. It's another symbol of the Crusades and is adopted by white nationalists, and supremacist groups. So we have here not only that, but we have also a person that he has some serious accusations in his lap. He hasn't been convicted, but there is things that I think they should take seriously. There's allegations of financial mismanagement of two right-wing veterans nonprofit that he used to work for, which Vets for Freedom and Concerned Veterans for America. So investigations from colleagues say that he was forced out because he, under allegations of financial mismanagement and claims of excessive drinking, inappropriate behavior. We also saw that 2017, there were accusations of sexual assault against him. A woman accused him of rape in a hotel in California, in Monterey. She went to a hospital, had a rape kit taken. Police opened an investigation. Prosecutors ultimately did not bring a charge, citing there were proof problems. And the reporting indicates he later allegedly paid the accuser in a settlement with a non-disclosure agreement. He admits sex, but insists it was consensual and denies the assault. So legally, there's no conviction, but politically, we are talking about very, very serious character with documented allegations, money pay, non-disclosure agreement signed. And this is the guy now in charge of probably the most determinant policy decisions of the US.
I mean, he was also responsible for the signal leak, if you don't remember, that happened earlier this year.